talking with God about kings and kingdoms. This week, political animals. 2 Samuel chapter 2 through 5. Come on in, let's check it out together.
All the Bubbas of the world, we got one mission in mind.
Welcome to the Biblical Channel. Always glad somebody is showing up. We here at the Biblical Channel, us. Well, anyhow, we really do believe that the Bible, as we call it, God's book, the good book, has in it the best resources for every single human being on the planet. The resources we need to navigate the world in which we live and to understand the world in which we live and the context in which we live it. So anyhow, at the Biblical Channel, we just want to ring the chamois of life to the best of our abilities, have a lot of fun along the way talking God, and God just simply wants to get us from the bullshit to the holy shit so that we can shoot the shit and sound like we actually know our shit. But the way God would say it is, pray continually, rejoice always, give thanks in all circumstances. That is the will of God for your life. Anyhow, 2 Samuel chapter 2 to chapter 5, we got a long way to go and a short time to get there, as the old song goes. So let's just dive in and see what's happening next. Last week, brief summary. We find the opening scene. Saul is dead. David is not. David gives an elegy of sorts after a strange moment with an Amalekite who seems to be reaching for some political gain. And it all backfires on him and he ends up dead. So the story now turns in chapter 2 to chapter 5 in what I would just summarize as political animalhood of mankind. So let's back up for a second and just say this about the Bible. The Bible describes the world that we live in. From its opening to its close, it describes the actual world, the real world that we live in. God is giving us a history. God is giving us a philosophy. God is giving us a sociology. And of course, God is giving us a theology. We have all of these things. We just need better ones. And that's the point that God is always making. You know, our version of history, our philosophy, our sociology, our theology needs to be checked with the greatest source of all, and that's God. So anyhow, from the beginning, God makes a broadcast message that there is a problem with the world. And the problem that God foresees and describes, for us is that we actually live in a world, and this is, folks, this is from Genesis chapter, 4, is we actually live in a world where Cain kills Abel for no real good reason. So all of our hurts and hangups can begin to be understood when God is the one telling us that we actually live in a world where Cain kills Abel for no really good reason. That is where the message really takes shape on earth for us. Of course, Adam and Eve give us some substance there as well. But for our purposes, let us just say that the world tends to give credit to Aristotle for saying that, well, man is basically a political animal. But God beats Aristotle to the punch like a rented mule. And God actually in chapter 2, 3, 4, and 5 of 2 Samuel is describing the ruthlessness of politics that, well, frankly, that Bill and Hillary and Barry and Joe all know all too well. And that many before them have known all too well, and many around them know all too well. And, that is just the nature of life. We live in a political landscape. We are political animals. Aristotle said it for sure, but Aristotle is a Johnny-come-lately to the scene when it comes to God. So 2 Samuel, for instance, predates, Aristotle by 600 years at least. And the substance of the message that God is bringing forward in this world really does wrap itself around politics. So anyhow, God is always seemingly talking politics. From Genesis chapter 4, where Cain builds a city, you have politics. Where mankind goes, there are states, there are governments, there are tribes and clans that are created. And the basic default position of human beings is clans and tribes. You know, the in groups and the out groups. And whenever you have the mentality of an in group or an out group, you have constant feuds. You have this status-based society based on who is in the in group and who is on the out group. And it's usually based around some sort of perception of a warped honor and shame as well. This is the backdrop that God describes from the beginning. And the problem with our default position of clans and tribes is that, you know, these feuds that arise between clans and tribes, they can seemingly go on forever. Americans in particular tend to have a pretty short view of history, and maybe that's good. But if you go anywhere else in the world, I remember a gentleman by the name of Ken Bailey talking about the surprise that he had when he got into a cab in Egypt and was talking to the cabbie. And I'll just say the nature of the conversation turned to the perspective of the cabbie, which, you know, was still the perspective of a 600-year-old battle and feud that had been going on. And he felt like it really had not changed. They're still living that. And that is the real world. That is the world in which we live in, because it is the default position of all of us as human beings. And we can get there pretty quick. The government or the politics that we, you know, put over us are by design, especially in America, by design to try to counteract the, you know, tribalisms and the clanisms that lead us to feuds, perpetuating feuds, etc. Well, anyhow, God's big story is in the setting of politics from the absolute beginning. And Aristotle is a moron compared to God when it comes to discussing politics and the politics of this world. Aristotle is green behind the ears. God is not. The gospel of God, the good news that God brings, is actually political, and we'll get to that in a moment. But we are wrong to think that the right politics are actually going to work out here on earth. So the politics, if we want to actually get somewhere that we employ, are going to have to be politics that get up and above the idea of, you know, clans and tribes, ins and outs, and have to get into the world of ideas, big ideas. And ladies and gentlemen, there is no bigger idea than the idea of God, who everybody says creates problems. But the reality is that the biblical God is offering us a candid conversation and actually a way forward to move us along in a healthy way, but yet at the same time recognizing we're really not going to get there as long as we're here on earth. Well, that's a lot of talky talk. Let's dive into the story, the political nature of what's before us, and that is 2 Samuel chapter 2, 3, 4, and 5. And so just the quick rundown, we have no time to read all of this, but that's fine because we just have, to tell the story and to summarize the story and to get the ebb and the flow of the story and pick up what's going on. I always encourage you to actually do the reading for yourself and just use me as an assist so that you can see what's going on. And if I've missed the mark on it somehow, then you should be able to tell that from the reading. But anyhow, as I have read and as I have heard it, and by the way, Mike Rowe does a series on Facebook called As I Heard It. I think that's the way it is. And he has a brilliant conversation with a ex-Green Beret guy, I believe. His name is Scott Mann. They have a sit down together for about an hour. And it is the thing of beauty. It is the kind of sense and sensibility that we should all have and we should all understand. And I just summarized a lot of what they just said in their conversation too. And we got to go to places that are helpful to our thinking and expand our thinking so that we can check ourselves before we wreck ourselves. But in chapter 2, verse 1 to 4, the story starts off with an obvious political bent because it's David's inauguration. And this is ironic because it just so happens that I am speaking to you on Inauguration Day. So chapter 2, verse 1 to 4 is David's inauguration, but the problem that we quickly find is that David's inauguration is really only in a small place, It's not in the big place of Israel. It's not amongst the 12 tribes. It's among one tribe in one place. And that place is Hebron, and Hebron is a city within the boundaries of the tribe called Judah. Now remember, no tribe in Israel was supposed to operate on their own. They were to work together. And in God's storyline, he's not even really creating a nation as much as he is creating a message for the other nations. We are told by Moses early on that this idea of a nation is doomed to failure, but God is going to move forward with it so that he can tell his story and so that we can examine life in a real and proper way with the difficulties around the ideas of politics and, sociologies and philosophies and theologies, etc. So, chapter 2, verse 1 to 4, Saul is dead. It's time for David to be king, but not so fast. David's only king in a small place in the whole nation of Israel. And what happens next is just the regular old humanity of ideas. And so anyhow, the one good note is that if we remember back to Genesis chapter 49, verse 10, when Jacob, spoke to all of his sons, which were all nincompoops, by the way. And if you want to go back and look at our Genesis series, do that. But the Bible does not present us with, unreachable characters. In fact, every character in the Bible is beatable by us. We can do better than every single character in the Bible. And that's the way God tells his story, so that you are encouraged, so that you get the courage to join God and his thinking. Well, anyhow, the good news is that the promise that Jacob gave from God to the world was that there would be a scepter, kingship that would come from the tribe of Judah, and that is David and his tribe, the tribe of Judah. So there is a promise and a fulfillment going on here that is good news, but it's hardly going to be good news when we start turning the pages. So in chapter 2, verse 5 to 7, we find David being very godly and very kingly. So this is the bifurcated, or complicated nature of David. There are times when David is very dim-witted, and the thing that makes David particularly dim-witted is his weaknesses revolving around, anger and women, something like that. But for now, David is keeping it very classy, and he has offered the olive branch, as the Romans might say. He has offered this, idea of steadfast love to all the people who supported Saul. He's making no qualms. He is ending the cycle of violence that had previously been going on between him and Saul by saying, listen, I am offering from God's own bosom. I am offering from Yahweh himself the steadfast love and faithfulness to all of you. Even if you were fighting literally against me, it's okay. Come one, come all is the message of David. Let's unify. Let's get this thing together. Then in chapter 2, verse 8 to 11, we find there's a problem. And the problem is around Abner. Abner is the right-hand man, or the king's hand, we might say, of Saul. And Abner's political muscle is firmly visible as he establishes his own inauguration, and he lifts up a son of Saul, Ishbosheth, and he lifts up Ishbosheth to be the king of the other 11 tribes. We know that this is going to be problematic, and indeed it is. So in chapter 2, verse 12 to 32, we meet two very important characters. One is Abner, who is Saul's right-hand man, or the king's hand, and the other is Joab, who is David's right-hand man, i.e., the king's hand, or maybe we'll call them the secretaries of defense, things like this. The interesting, I think, kind of grab from Joab's background is that Joab is actually David's nephew, and this Zeruiah is David's sister. And it seems like she is a political force unto herself, if I'm getting the story right here. And she raises up 3 sons that will be the defense department, of David. And her 3 sons are Joab, Abishai, and Asahel. So the storyline down to verse 32 of chapter 2, starts getting, very political, and the politics of might and war, take shape as Abner and Joab assemble, the troops at a place or a pool in Gilboa, or Gibeon rather, in Gibeon. And they start this thing off by having their 12 best fighting men fight each other, and David's men quickly grab the heads and ram the spear into Abner's men. Game on, the war is on. The idea behind this, between Abner and Joab at least, is that might makes right. So the idea here is that, whoever wins is the political victor. But except that doesn't work out, because when Joab's or David's men win, well, it just turns into an all-out escalated war. And there we have it. That is the way it goes in the real world in which we live. The politics of punishment and retribution now take the spotlight because, in all of this, one of the 3 sons, Asahel, sees that Abner is on the run and cannot leave well enough alone. And so he pursues Abner on foot. And it's kind of a comedy of this foot chase, because as this foot chase is happening, Abner is trying to speak with Asahel, and he's actually trying to speak some reason to Asahel. And this small voice in Abner of godliness starts to appear, because Abner says, "Hey, man, I don't want to kill you. I don't want that on my hands. We've shed enough blood." And then, to Asahel's, credit, they stop, I guess. But as they stop, Asahel can't let it go. And Abner, ends up killing Asahel. Whoa. Now we have, exactly the substance of the kinds of feuds that will never end. Because Joab, the brother of Asahel, he is certainly not going to let this go, and that's part of the story backdrop, is he will not let the death of his brother go, but we're not quite there yet. But the politics of punishment and retribution are now part of the landscape. The retribution or the vengeance of Asahel are going to have to happen, and it's going to keep this thing going. Abner, to his credit, did try to stave this thing off, and Abner does appeal to Joab's, sense of godliness and saying, "Hey, we've got to stop this fighting, in God's name." And Joab, to his credit, says, "Okay, you're right. We shouldn't do that." But then the game is quickly back on, and we don't get a lot of details. So when we emerge or move over to chapter 3, the beginning of chapter 3, we find pretty much the end. The narrator steps in to tell us that basically this long war transpires between the house of Saul and the house of David. David grows stronger and stronger. Saul becomes weaker and weaker, meaning Abner, is weaker and weaker, and Joab is stronger and stronger because they are the ones doing the bidding for the kings, supposedly. And so anyhow, that, verse 1 just kind of tells us how the story ends, but it is certainly not the end. There's a lot of political mischief that is going to happen from here on out. Chapter 3, verse 2 provides for us a fairly strange intermission, because in this period of time, David takes on more and more wives and has more and more children, which is probably the second big voice of man, is not only politics, but sex. And, while Aristotle might have called man a political animal, many others have called man just a sexual animal. And both of these things create many of the problems of mankind. especially as it revolves around the idea of a status society and honor and shame in a warped and, kind of distorted, place, in groups and out groups and constant feuds. It's usually, politics and sex that are behind the scenes of all of this. So in chapter 3, verse 6, we find the politics of hurts and hang-ups and betrayals, taking on more life. Abner, turns out he has sex too. He has sex with one of Saul's old concubines, and Ishbosheth says something funny. He says, "Hey, why are you sleeping with my father's concubines?" And the implication is that, are you really going for the throne here? Are you the de facto king? Which the answer is yes. But it really makes Abner mad. So mad that we find, that he's butthurt over the whole thing. And he is so butthurt that he now betrays Ishbosheth. And he goes over to the house of David, to the camp of David. And he says, "You know what, David, let's reconcile this whole thing since I don't like Ishbosheth anymore." Keep in mind, it was Abner that started this mess to begin with. And now he has betrayed Ishbosheth. And Ishbosheth, for his part, is really just playing the innocent. He just asked an innocent question, but he touched the third rail, or a sensitive nerve, when it comes to Abner. And, well, the game continues. The politics of blood feud now take on full force in chapter 3, verse 22. Turns out that Abner and David have a successful meeting. Abner promises to relinquish all of the 11 tribes over to David. David agrees, says this is a good move. Abner says good move. David sends Abner off in peace. Joab comes onto the scene. David tells him what happened, and Joab says, "You can't trust this guy." And he takes off after Abner, takes matters into his own hands, kills Abner with a kind of foot chase of his own, in living to tell the same story that about his brother and Abner. Well, anyhow, it's just the same old stuff. Joab justifies his personal beef with Abner by, claiming to do God's work, that he's really the true king's, hand, and he doesn't think that Abner is trustworthy, and so he just takes matters into his own hand and kills Abner. Keep in mind, nobody has asked God for any points of view. Nobody is seeking God, and that is the background of the story. The politics of blood feud are in full force. David intervenes in verse 31 of chapter 3 to publicly disagree. He keeps it classy, and at the same time, he seems like he keeps it dysfunctional. David says to all of Israel, "I am not behind this. I did not support this of Joab," but at the same time, he doesn't really punish Joab. So, and David says something here that we'll come around to end our talk, but David says something to kind of gain the credibility of the people. David says, I will not eat bread or taste anything until the sun goes down, to indicate that his kingdom is not, about this violence, that his kingdom has not supported this violent outburst. And, there you go. We're coming back to that in a moment. But in chapter 4, the politics of hurts and hang-ups continue. And, actually, the politics of political gain, take full force. Ishbosheth is now left unprotected by Abner. He's nervous about this. And then the thugs within Abner's, military leadership now decide for themselves that they are going to execute Ishbosheth. What has Ishbosheth done? Nothing. That's part of the point. And so they kill Ishbosheth. They take his head, they give it to David in expectation that David is going to congratulate them and reward them with some sort of government position. David reminds them that there was an Amalekite that he killed for lesser stuff, and so he kills them. End of chapter 4. Chapter 5. We finally have David's inauguration as the king of all 12 tribes. And let's just say that's the thrust of it. That's the kind of the end of it all. And as the reader, we read this and we're like, well, I'm not sure I get the point of the story. Well, let me remind you what the point of the story is. The point of the story is that God understands the nature of humanity very, very well. And in the establishment of any kind of kingdom on earth, this is the way of man. Even in the people of God that God has called out of Abraham to be his people, to be his representation, to make the world a different place, even they will simply resort to the ways of this world. And it's a mess. And God is openly showing us that this world, no matter what, will resort to the messiness and dysfunctional ways of a clan-based or tribal-based or an in versus out, group-based kind of mentality that results in constant feuds and feuds that seemingly last forever unless somebody breaks the cycle and elevates the whole thing to a level of steadfast love like God is actually behind. So, where does that leave us here? Well, on one hand, David is now king as God providentially expected. God gets his way. David is going to be king. But if we think that this kingdom under David is truly the kingdom that God imagined, is wrong. Because the kingdom that God imagines is much bigger and much better than David. David will have to be reminded by God that his bloodshed has stained the storyline too much. And that, Moses' words from the beginning before they ever had kings and a kingdom is a warning that this will come unraveled because there is a greater purpose that God will bring into this world. And ultimately, the greater purpose is of a kingdom not of this world. And that's how I want to end. When Jesus institutes the Lord's Supper, he is the end of the story. He's the goal. He's the real providential end. He is technically a son of David, fulfilling the promise that God, revealed through Abraham's grandson Jacob, that there would be a ruler that comes from the clan or the tribe of Judah. But when Jesus sits his apostles down for the Last Supper and gets done drinking the wine, the Gospels record for us what Jesus says. And what Jesus says is that I tell you the truth. I myself will not drink of this wine until the kingdom of God. Now, many of us have kind of heard that in church, as we have celebrated the Lord's Supper. And we have heard that without understanding the political nature to what Jesus is saying. In a similar way, the construction of the sentence that Jesus uses is very similar to the construction of the sentence that David uses whenever he tells Israel that I tell you, I am not going to eat this bread until the sun goes down, to show you that violence is not from me, and violence is not the way of God, and that I don't support Joab. Jesus, on the night before, he is betrayed and dies, indicates that he too is going to fast. He too is going to refrain, because violence and the upcoming violence to him and his death is not the way, is not the way that the kingdom on earth will work. But it is the way the kingdom that God is setting up on earth will happen. And so, in one way, Jesus is, endorsing the Old Testament, endorsing, the story before him, and that he is the same story. And he is the end of the story, the climactical end of the story. And in the Lord's Supper, when we take the Lord's Supper, we recognize that we are political animals and that the politics of this world are driven away in the death and resurrection of the Lord Jesus Christ, who is establishing a true kingdom that is yet to come. As Jesus would tell Pilate that his kingdom is not of this world. And as God tells us in the pages of his book, the real kingdom is a political kingdom. God is king. Jesus is king. He's the Prince of Peace, but he is the Lord of Lords, and every knee will bow. And indeed, he is fasting from the violence of this world to bring in a better kingdom. And that's where we'll end our time.